Hello, everyone. Today, I will be your guide for this video. Do you often find yourself doing the same tasks over and over again in Excel? If so, then you need to learn about macros. A macro is a small program written in Visual Basic for Applications, VBA, that can perform repetitive tasks in Excel, thereby saving time. In this episode, we will explore how to use macros in Excel. We are going to learn how to enable, create, edit, and run macros, as well as how to save files that contain macros. Moreover, we will learn how to create a Personal Macro Workbook, which can centralize macros for use across different files. Please note that in Microsoft Office apps like Excel, you can reach the same screen or perform the same tasks using different tabs, buttons, or menus. However, we will only focus on the major methods we consider to be more efficient or more suitable for beginners, as covering all methods could be cumbersome and confusing. Let's get started. Enabling macros. Since your current Excel settings may not allow macros to run, you may need to enable macros first. To do this, open Excel and click on the File tab in the upper left corner. Click on Options at the bottom of the menu. In the Excel Options dialog box that opens, click on Trust Center in the left pane. Click on the Trust Center Settings button on the right. In the Trust Center dialog box that opens, click on Macro Settings in the left pane. Generally, users choose Disable All Macros with Notification because the Enable All Macros option may be risky and make your computer vulnerable to potentially dangerous code. After selecting the appropriate option, click OK to close the dialog box. Centralizing macros in Personal Macro Workbook. Centralized macro files store macros that you can access across all your documents in the respective applications. This way, you don't have to remember or find where your macros are located every time you need them. Another significant advantage is that they help prevent the confusion and potential errors that can arise from having different versions of macros kept in different files. Centralizing your macros helps to ensure that you're using the most up-to-date and correct version, and not accidentally using deprecated versions. Such files are therefore incredibly useful tools that can help automate repetitive tasks, increase your productivity, and maintain consistency in your macro usage. In Word, the centralized macro file is the normal template, that is normal.dotm. In Excel, it's called the Personal Macro Workbook. Its file name is personal.xlsb, and it's usually located in the Excel Start folder. This special workbook stores the macros that you record, create, or collect. It's a hidden workbook that opens automatically when Excel starts. By saving your macros in this file, you can access them from any workbook that you open in Excel. Developer tab. Before you can create macros, you need to enable the Developer tab. In MS Office apps, this tab isn't displayed by default. If the Developer tab isn't visible in the ribbon, you can enable it by following these steps. Click on File and then Options. In the Options dialog box, click on Customize ribbon. On the right side of the dialog box, under Main tabs, find and check the box for Developer. Click on OK to save your changes. Now, you should see the Developer tab in your ribbon. By the way, in MS Office apps, you can also use the View tab's macro buttons. However, the View tab offers fewer options and is less flexible. The Developer tab provides more comprehensive tools and options for creating, running, and managing macros. So it is often better to use the Developer tab. Recording macro. To create a Personal Macro Workbook, you need to record a macro and choose to store it there. When recording a macro, nearly every action is captured, including mistakes. Therefore, users should be familiar with the steps before recording and avoid unnecessary ones during recording. If errors occur, it is often more efficient to re-record the sequence rather than edit the VBA code, which can be long and complex. This approach helps avoid errors and makes the macro you create more efficient when played back. Here are the steps to record a macro. 1. Open a new or existing workbook in Excel. 2. Go to the Developer tab in the ribbon and click on Record Macro. As mentioned above, you can also use the View tab's macro functions to record macro. 3. In the Record Macro dialog box, enter a name for your macro or use the default name. 4. In the Store Macro in drop-down list, select Personal Macro Workbook. This is the most important step, because this will create the Personal Macro Workbook file if it doesn't exist already, or add your macro to it if it does. Please note that storing all macros in the Personal Macro Workbook can be quite confusing and not necessarily desirable. If you want to record your macros in the current or other files, you may select it from the drop-down list. 5. Click OK to start recording your macro. You will find the Record Macro button has changed to Stop Recording. 6. Perform the actions that you want your macro to do. For example, you can insert a new worksheet, format some cells, or enter some data. 7. When you have finished the steps, click on Stop Recording. Congratulations, you have created your first macro and the Personal Macro Workbook. Editing macros in Visual Basic Editor. After recording a macro in the Personal Macro Workbook, you might want to know what this macro looks like. However, you cannot edit or see the macro directly by choosing Edit in the Macro dialog box. An error message will appear as this workbook is hidden by default. You can unhide the file, but it is quite inconvenient. To open the Visual Basic Editor (VBE) window where you can see, write, and modify your macros, you can follow these steps. A. Open the Developer tab and then click on Visual Basic, or B. Press the shortcut key Alt F11. The VBE should appear on your screen. In the Project Explorer window, you can find the files which are currently open, including your Personal Macro Workbook, listed under the name VBA Project, personal.xlsb. This is where Excel stores all your macros that are available across all your workbooks. Inside the VBA project, you'll see a folder named Modules. This is where the actual code of your macros resides. You can double-click on the Modules folder to expand it and see all the modules that contain your macros. To edit the macros, double-click the module that contains your macro. This opens the module in the code window on the right. Here, you can modify the code as needed. To edit a specific macro, from the drop-down list at the top of the code window, select the macro you want to edit. After editing, you can save the changes by clicking on the Save icon or by pressing Ctrl+S. Simple Case Study. We have recorded a simple macro as a case study. What we did is just setting a cell's color to yellow. The macro generated is used here to explain what a macro is. The first line, sub color cell, is the start of the macro. Sub is a keyword used to define the start of a macro in VBA. Color cell is the name of the macro. In VBA, macro names must start with a letter and can contain letters, numbers, and underscores. Spaces cannot be used in macro names, and you can use underscores to separate words. The pair of parentheses after sub-color cell is required to define a macro. As the macro doesn't take any parameters, there are empty parentheses. The second line is a comment describing the function of the macro. Comments begin with an apostrophe and are ignored by VBA. You can use comments to describe your code in words to help make it easier to understand. Then, there is a block of code between with selection, interior and end with. This code applies to the interior, which means the background, of the currently selected cells. Pattern equals XL solid sets the pattern of the cell background to solid. Pattern color index equals XL automatic sets the pattern color to automatic. Color equals 65535 sets the background color of the cell. The number 65535 represents yellow in Excel's color system. Tint and shade equals 0 and pattern tint and shade equals 0 set the tint and shade of the pattern to 0, meaning no additional tint or shade is applied to the color. The last line, end sub, is a keyword used in VBA to define the end of a macro. From this example, it is quite clear that users, especially beginners, may find it difficult to know and remember what names or terms to use to do a specific task through VBA programming. Fortunately, we can record macros so we can create the codes and still understand what they are about, as the terms used are rather self-explanatory. We also observe that one drawback of recording a macro is that it will often generate codes that are unnecessary and clumsy, like setting tint and shade to 0 in this example. As this video is not about VBA programming, we will not discuss how to simplify the code here. However, our channel does have VBA for beginners videos, which you may find useful. Running macros using macro dialog box. Now it's time to test whether this macro works or not. To run your macros from the Personal Macro Workbook or other files, you should open the macro dialog box first. This box can be opened by 1. Press the shortcut key Alt F8. 2. Click on the Developer tab and choose Macros. 3. Click on the View tab and choose Macros, and then choose View Macros. In this dialog box, you can perform other functions like deleting macros too. To run your macros, select your macro from the list and click Run. Now let's run our recorded macro and see whether it works or not. After running the macro, as expected, it turns the selected range to yellow. Creating your own macros using VBA. Recording is not the only way to create macros, you can also create your own. As we mentioned above, a macro is a small program written in Visual Basic for Applications, VBA. So you can also create your own macros using VBA. For example, you can add this self-made macro before or after your recorded macro in the Visual Basic editor. This simple macro uses the built-in subroutine MSG box in VBA to display a message box. The call keyword is used to call a subroutine that takes 0 or more arguments. In this case, the argument is the string hello world, which is enclosed in quotation marks. After you create this macro, it will show up in the macro dialog box together with the recorded one. When this macro is run, it will display hello world in a message box. It should be noted that not every macro will necessarily appear in the macro dialog box. The dialog box only displays standalone subroutines, in other words, macros that can run independently. Subroutines requiring an argument to be passed when called are not considered standalone, hence they do not appear in the dialog box. If you want to know more about creating macros with arguments, you can watch our video, Beginner's Tutorial on Macro or VBA in MS Office, Part 1 Variables, Parameters, and Subroutines. This video will provide you with a deeper understanding of how parameters and arguments work in VBA and how they can enhance the functionality of your macros. If you know more about VBA, you can revise your recorded macros and make them more suited to your needs. Saving macros in Excel. After editing the macros in the Personal Macro Workbook, you can save the changes by clicking on the Save icon or pressing Ctrl+S in the Visual Basic editor. If changes are not saved when you exit Excel, you'll be prompted to save the Personal Macro Workbook. Confirming this will save your macros in the personal.xlsb file. In case the macros are created in another file instead of the Personal Macro Workbook, you have to save the file as a macro-enabled workbook. To do this, go to File, Save As and select a location for the file. Then under Save As Type, select Excel Macro-Enabled Workbook, XLSM, give your file a name, and click Save. That's it for our tutorial. In this episode, we covered how to enable, create, edit, and run macros in Excel, as well as how to create the Personal Macro Workbook and save the files. You can find more information in the video description. If you like this tutorial, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for more videos on our channel. Thank you for watching and see you next time.